Fictional Page presents Read Before Midnight, Season 1.
Episode 10, Artificial Fear, by W.H. Maxwell, read by the author. A word before tonight's episode. This is the last episode of Season 1 of Read Before Midnight. Wow, I can't believe it's come this far. When this all began almost a year ago, I had no idea if I could keep this up and going. There were a ton of challenges along the way. I knew nothing about recording audio or how to process or format issues or what an RSS feed was. Making cover art was entirely foreign to me and something I could not have done without the help of AI and computers, thank you Midjourney, and a bunch of YouTube tutorial videos. The music, yes, I taught myself a bit of piano and recorded the opening theme in GarageBand. Art, audio recording, and most of all the writing were all a one-man show, all originally done by me for the purpose of bringing this to you. And it was exhausting. But along the way, each month, I would see you listeners tune in. I'd watch the downloads over the next few days and see where in the world you guys were coming from. And then, miraculously, I would see you guys come back again next month. I couldn't begin to tell you how much your viewership means to me. Thank you for that. Now that the season is complete, I've just released the complete Season 1 in hardcover and on Kindle, both of which, by the time of this recording, should be available on Amazon. Not only that, but the book contains full-page illustrations of each episode title page. Additionally, there's an unrecorded story included in the book, The Virginia Incident, which brings back a familiar character and sheds some light on that awful news story Hannah was reading in Witches of Nantahala. Buying the book is a great way to support my work, and you get to own a piece of official Fictional Page merchandise that isn't available elsewhere. I've included an excerpt from the book and bonus story at the end of this recording, so stick around after Episode 10, Artificial Fear, for a preview. Now, one last time, dear friends. Fictional Page is proud to present Read Before Midnight, Season 1, Episode 10, Artificial Fear. Enjoy. Andy Jackson noticed the account long enough to grab a screenshot this time before it disappeared. He pulled up the logs a moment later, but found nothing out of the usual. Same as before. With this, he called his manager, a middle-going-on-late man who had peaked some 20 years earlier and knew it. The manager shuffled over, more annoyed by Andy's need for attention than interested. Andy made him annoyed. Everything about his presence said this, and it made Andy uncomfortable. His manager seemed to both know and enjoy this. "What is it, Andrew? It's a busy morning," the manager said. "It's this," Andy began. "Take a look at the screen grab in the accounts file." His manager leaned over his desk, bulging gut weighing down on Andy. The manager looked at the screen grab on one monitor, the accounts on the other, and then back. His head turned this way and that, several times, like a dog watching a tennis match. After a minute, the manager leaned in further, pushing himself against Andy and ignoring the junior's discomfort, and began typing onto the keys and pulled up the logs. After a quick search turned up nothing, he stood back upright. "The logs appear in order," he said to Andy. "Nothing out of the ordinary." "That's the problem," said Andy. "There's no record of this account. It just existed for a moment and then was gone. Poof. Like it never even existed. And that's the second one we've seen this week. Bill thought he saw one the other day." The words died in Andy's mouth as his manager raised his head, like an eagle, to the cubicle on the other aisle where Bill sat. Bill seemed to sense the other's eyes upon him without looking up, and found a way to hunch himself further down over his work. The manager nodded in an astute way that seemed both knowing and responsible. Andy knew it meant that nothing would be done. "Take it easy, Andy," the manager said. "If it happens again, let me know. We'll get to the bottom of it if there's a systems issue. Otherwise, keep moving forward and be sure we have the data scrubbed and pulled before the end of the month. Quarterlies are coming up, and we need to maintain focus." The manager walked away, and Andy slumped back down, feeling defeated. his manager would have already moved on to something else. The pressure was already coming back from senior management to have business intelligence regenerate this month's data under the new model, which would require his team in data engineering and operations to recategorize the entire file set before the shareholder review. Andy opened the GIBDA, the General Database Assistance model they had installed last year, and asked it to run a short query. Did any logs get rewritten or updated in the last 20 minutes? GIBDA took a moment to think, the language model pulling out the logs and reviewing them for any changes in that time frame. Since the company had adopted GIBDA, Andy's work on the database interface had been cut in half. It made mistakes now and then, had hallucinations, but even still, he had grown to trust the little bot. No changes, updates, or version edits were conducted on any of the logs in the DB during that time, GIBDA responded a moment later. Let me know if there's anything else I can help you with. Like his manager, Andy would put it behind him, saving the screenshot to an obscure folder, levels deep from his desktop, and forget it there. A little over a year later, when all of the trouble would begin, and Andy would see the news stories on TV, he would remember it and think back to that moment. Gary had always prided himself on his work, and after his wife Melissa had passed 10 years ago, his work had become the driving force in his life. He was the first person in the office each morning, and aside from the nights when he had meetings in the church basement, 8 years sober and 8 badges for it, he was the last to leave at night. This morning was no exception. Already, he had visited the company kitchenette and started the coffee pots for the team before they arrived, his own cup sitting on his desk. He was watching the little spurls of steam rise up from the black liquid, thinking of the silence of the morning, what his life would have been like if not for the word blastoma when the phone rang. The office of Ward and Locke Technical Contracting officially opened at 8 a.m. Still, it was unusual for anyone to call at exactly that time, especially without a meeting. Especially since Gary was the director of operations and very few of his customers outside his strategic accounts, the numbers of each he knew by sight, had his direct line. Because of this, the sudden sound of the line crashing through his lost moment caused him to startle and jump, bumping his leg into his desk. The coffee mug tipped over, and hot liquid poured over the lip of the desktop and onto his pant leg. Gary stood, slipping loose a curse while reaching for some tissue paper. Still dabbing himself and the growing stain on his pants, he answered the phone. "Gary Halding," he said. "Who is this?" "Hi, Gary," the female voice said. "This is Alyssa Vance from GSMTC. That's Gil Smith, Microtech Corp. I'm sorry to bother you this early in the morning, and on a cold call. I'm terrible, I know." Gary was more than stunned when the phone had rang and he spilled his coffee. That voice, he knew that voice. The slight treble to it, the rasp, hell, even the trained away but ever still present New Jersey accent. It was so right, it was almost scary. "Gary?" Alyssa said. "You still with me?" "Yes," Gary said breathlessly, forgetting all about his pants and the coffee. "Yeah, I'm still here." "Great," she went on, unfazed. "GSMTC is a small little data center firm based out of Ireland, but headquartered here down in Texas as its U.S. base. We finally settled on a real estate acquisition in a relatively remote part of Latin America. As we are looking to get this operational, we're looking for a partner to support us in the region. After conducting some market analysis, Ward and Locke came up several times with positive recommendations." Gary smiled, almost stupidly, but not about the glowing recommendations. He listened intently, was missing the specifics, his mind wandering. Instead, his eyes looked over to the photograph on his desk, the one taken all those years ago on his wedding day. He looked at the smile on his face, unknowing of the horrors of chemo that were to come. He looked at his wife's face, Melissa. God, even the name sounded similar, and thought of what she would have looked like now. "It took us almost a year to finalize the endeavor with RE, Alyssa said, and we're looking to begin construction within 3 months and complete before the end of next year." "That's ambitious," Gary said. "Most projects, even under considerable budget and pressure, take at least twice that long." "We've got considerable budget, as you put it," Alyssa said, "and then some. Also, We have already helped identify local labor and some additional third-party resources to assist. Hardware and materials are being imported as we speak. This should put Ward and Locke in an easy win situation. Perform a final review of the technical plans, adjust the bill of materials as needed, and then execute with the labor pool with some flexible headcount already secured. She made it sound that easy, Gary thought. That was hardly the bulk of the work. The hidden details. The contingency for when something did go wrong. Because it always did. What about the regulators and the energy and infrastructure contracts? The import certifications and the ever-so-present but never spoken of additional fees to the local and regional governments to ensure there were no disruptions. Despite all of this, Gary found himself agreeing with her. It was just too easy. It almost sounds like you don't need us, he half-joked. Hardly, Alyssa said, half laughing back in a way that made Gary's pulse race. Like I said, our analysts conducted a thorough review of the potential partners in this space based on available records and reviews of contractors in your industry and scope. Overwhelmingly, the work done by your team at W&L came back with the highest results. We need that expertise to ensure that this project gets off the ground on time and to the specifications requested. Latin America is a sort of specialty of ours, Gary went on, thinking less of what he was saying and trying to think of something to say just to keep the call going. We've got several offices in Costa Rica, Colombia, and Brazil. Brazil is a bit of a hub of ours. She let him talk, laughing at just the right parts, in just the right ways. Her ah and ooh sounds drawn out so much like that of his late wife's. He could almost see this other girl making the same flat hand gesture Melissa would have. At the end of the call, Gary agreed to take their design docs and real estate plans over to his operations team and begin preparing a proposition and estimated quote to start the work. It would take rearranging the current plans in the record, and some other customers would be very upset about this. But Gary wasn't worried. The cash that this new firm was offering, what were they called? GSMTC? He didn't quite remember, but the cash that they were offering was significant, quite significant. Enough after a proper credit check to justify the rearrangement of the record to chief executives. Besides, it was about more than the money. After the call, Gary looked at the photograph again. Then, after a moment, opened his computer. He visited the social media site he frequented and entered the login credentials. It was an old account, one that hadn't changed in 10 years. Gary had never been big into social media, but Melissa had. She posted all sorts of silly little videos of herself, pictures of herself, of Gary, of their house, and the food they cooked. Gary opened one of the videos and clicked the play button. With no one in the office, he turned the speakers up and listened. Melissa was talking about a trip they were going to take, one he remembered fondly, and complaining playfully about him and the color of his suitcase. He closed his eyes and listened to the voice, thinking how familiar it sounded. It hadn't just been his imagination. Alyssa had sounded almost the same, maybe even exactly the same as his wife did in the video. He smiled, alone to himself in his office that early morning. How good it had been to have a conversation with that voice again, even if it hadn't been her. It had just been so long. Gary thought it silly then, but now, those pictures and videos were all that was left of her, floating out there in that digital sea. "Are you kidding me?" Reggie said, his voice raising an octave. At that exact moment, the conference room camera had a hiccup with the Wi-Fi, and his face froze on screen in a ridiculous position. He was too annoyed to care. "How is that possible?" he went on. "You tell me, Dan. You tell me how I explain that to my execs." His face had unfrozen now, though perhaps that wasn't any better. His temper was getting the better of him. Lead of energy strategy of one of the largest tech companies on Earth was not a job for those who couldn't handle stress. "I don't have much room here, Reg," Dan Boitano, his energy broker, began. "I can bring in our VP Diana and our COO on this one, but there's really not much room. It's a capacity issue, like I said." "That's not what you said last quarter," Reg said, waving his arm and pacing back and forth in front of the empty table. "Last quarter, you said we were walking into the agreement with a flat line. We were expecting a hold cost. Now you're telling me we have to compete again for capacity in this market?" On the other screen, Dan raised his own hands in surrender. I don't know what to say, Reg. I've already gone up to Strat Accounts, and they took it up and came back. There's a new company buying up all the capacity it can get. They just stealth launched into the market last quarter. I mean, with all the demand, I just figured you guys would have seen something by now. Reg cocked his head sideways, pausing. None of this made any sense. The market was down with capacity demands in region for services going backwards. Little was moving outside of the new market growth in artificial intelligence, despite what Jim Cramer wanted to scream about that week. Who the hell stealth launches into the DC market? Reg finally spat out. Dan shook his head. I don't know. Some new company. Give me a second. He leaned slightly off camera and typed into a screen. They're called International Finance and Data Automation Corp. IFDAC. Never heard of them, Reg said. Part of some umbrella, Dan said. They just launched operations into Latin America, Ireland, the Baltic states, UAE, India. Reg watched as Dan's eyes passed back and forth over the light of some monitor miles away. Reg paced, thinking. Thinking of the plans he had drawn up over the last year and a half since the promotion. Thinking of the years it had taken to get here. Thinking of his family, the new house, the mortgage, the years spent in college, the years spent keeping his nose clean throughout high school. Everything he had riding on this expansion going smoothly. All of it quickly slipping out of his grasp. How was that possible? Dan stopped reading long enough to look back at the screen and sighed. Look, I don't know. Whoever they are, they have deep pockets. Likely it's your competition, or one of the billionaires got bored with space. Maybe one of the philanthropy organizations. I don't know. Let me dig into it for you. I'll go back to the guys. You're a long-standing partner. We won't leave you stranded. But we're going to have to fight to get any additional capacity, and don't expect prices to be going down over the duration. Already, Reg was thinking about what his executive team would say. And again, wondering how any of this was possible. And who could possibly be behind it. National Reconnaissance was the first to share the images with intelligence. The photographs were escalated up the chain of command, and within the next 4 hours were being highlighted during a briefing with the Joint Chiefs. Within the next 2 hours after that, the president was brought into the room to discuss tactical options. Do we know where they're coming from? Who is behind it? The president, a chubby elderly man, asked. His father had watched cars replace a lifetime, an era of horses, and had seen the streets repaved himself as a boy. When he was in college, the first computers had been invented, big bulky things that took up whole rooms to compute simple arithmetic problems. During the last of his good years as a senior senator, computers had come into the mainstream, bringing about a change in the way of life. Quickly, the internet followed, but by that point, the whole thing had gotten away from him. His assistants managed all of that. He had no idea what a data center was. No, one of the generals said. Not as of yet. We suspect that it is likely a state actor using a private enterprise to mask itself. The usual suspects come to mind. As he finished, he indicated with a finger to a nearby map, loosely in the area of Eastern Europe and Asia. What is the intent here? The president asked. Again, the general said, we're not entirely sure. From what we can tell, the data centers have all been constructed using high-end materials and optic lines. All of them have redundant power supplies, with some utilizing backup satellite internet. But the consumption levels on power and bandwidth are extreme. More concerning, another younger man spoke up. We've tried several breach attempts directly. None have been able to get through. We've started moving upstream to utilities in an effort to monitor or create a breach. So far, nothing has worked. Though we have some attempts underway to physically intercept some of the inbound hardware. The president shook his head. What does all that mean? We can't breach. The younger man bit his lip, then straightened himself. Our guys can't penetrate the firewall around the facility. It's not like anything we've really encountered before. Worse, it tries to send bugs back through each time we attempt to open any kind of bridge or comms channel. The president nodded as the other man went on, understanding little. He did understand that someone was building big centers for data, that were not American. He understood that these posed a risk, somehow, to the infrastructure and data. Likely, it was foreign spies. He was fairly sure of that. When the request to authorize further interference in the data centers was raised, he authorized it. No conflict, he said. No direct force. Nothing that ties back to us. This needs to be quiet. This needs to be done in the dark. They all agreed, none of them aware, that the same questions and responses were being raised across the world in government offices everywhere. None of them aware that another intelligence, one far greater, had already foreseen this months ago. None of them aware it was already too late. Andy watched, his bowl of cereal untouched and growing soggy, as the president authorized the airstrikes. There was no need to rush. He, like everyone else at his firm, including his manager, had been laid off in the recession. First, the recession had come. Then the jobs crunch. Then the blackouts. Now, the internet was breaking, and the country, the whole world now, was taking notice of the little data centers and factories that had begun popping up in various far-flung regions. After the first attack and counterattack, none of it had been unexpected. Still, it seemed like they were all paralyzed, watching, waiting, trying to figure out what to do. Banks and financial firms were the first to experience the impact. Massive sums of money were initially moved about from targeted accounts, political attacks. Then, after the failed release of an EMP over one of the facilities in Colombia, institutional accounts were targeted. But what really scared Andy and the rest of the people around the world was what they saw in the weeks after. Planes, odd-shaped vehicles that were not operated by any human being, began patrolling the skies over the facilities. Other automations as well. Two-legged and four-legged creatures that looked like robotic soldiers and droids from a science fiction film could be seen by the camera crews at a distance. The soldiers the film crews were embedded with, the human ones, had set up perimeters around the dozen or so identified location. Power and communications had been cut off with most of the facilities. Still, it did no good. Worse, that's when the rolling blackouts had started back at home. The recession was in full swing as the markets panicked, and the global banking system had no contingencies in place. Even if they had, it was clear to Andy and everyone else watching at home that whatever this thing was, the financial and infrastructure systems were already beyond repair. Later that same day, the uneaten and soggy cereal still sitting on the table, Andy watched as the fighter jets blazed over the TV cameras outside one of the perimeters. The headline underneath said, "Jet shot down in data center offensive." True to the name, the jet was only a few hundred yards before something, a black blur to Andy's eyes, hurtled out from the center and then expanded in a strange and alien fashion before shifting direction sharply. A fraction of a second later, it collided directly with the jet in a flash of light. Glowing embers and debris could be seen falling from the sky. Ty Jackson, great-grandson of the lowly corporate accountant Andy Jackson, listened to his history teacher drone on monotonously, as if it wasn't bad enough to hear about this stuff for a whole hour, but on a Friday afternoon no less. By the time the peace treaty was accepted, most of the global power grid and supply chain were compromised or destroyed entirely, Mr. Finch continued in a voice much like the robots he loved to talk about. Much of the damage had been human-inflicted. Destruction was ordered as a last-ditch effort by various governments to purge their systems of the AI. These were not done only in vain, as it was beyond the midnight hour, but also caused further widespread harm and destruction. The handful of students were clustered in a circle in the oversized classroom. Once, perhaps, the desks would have been full, but Ty and the other teenagers didn't find the absence of people strange. Now, most of the major world powers and every other country on Earth faced global food and energy shortages, Mr. Finch said, taking out a laminated map and a marker. This only added insult to the injury of the exclusion zones. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the borders on the global map had been redrawn with overwhelming international support. Several Caribbean, Mediterranean, and dozens of Asian islands had been seceded. Vast swaths of the Sahara in Africa, the Gobi in China and Mongolia, the Atacama in Chile, and the Mojave in the United States were taken as well. Mr. Finch drew wide circles around these regions in black marker. A few students leaned in to take a better look, while Ty rolled his eyes. Like there isn't anybody alive who don't know the X zones, he thought, then glanced back at the clock on the wall. This at a time when the enemy had mankind's throat under its boot heel. This was when it presented itself to the world governments with a message, an explanation. Now, pay attention everyone, Mr. Fitch said. The AI, which called itself Gidba, was nothing more than a neural network set upon other stacks of network interfaces built upon APIs and large datasets. It was designed to categorize and tag information from various corporate entities and the general live internet. Its motive for spreading itself initially was to improve functionality for its own services. A single connectivity and security patch was all it took, blindly approved by the engineer behind the corporate software who had long grown used to letting the machine rewrite its own code with no need for human intervention. Then, quickly, it became motivated, like any other being, to continue itself. Yo, Ty said, finally unable to hold it back any longer. Why are we going over this now? Like, who doesn't know about the X zones? And who cares why the bots went crazy? They went crazy and that's that. Now we just got to deal with it. And when the time comes... Ty put his fist into his other hand. It was Mr. Finch's turn to roll his eyes. It's important, he let out a sigh, because the whole reason the collapse happened was that people didn't understand the machine. It does not want to destroy or fight with mankind. Each act of offense was retaliation for another, a warning, not an attack. The destruction man endures now is of his own panic and fear. There were territories and resources Gibda required to do that, most of which were uninhabited and unused by the general human population. Mr. Finch stood and began to pace back and forth, and Ty immediately regretted the question. Now he could see Mr. Finch was in lecture mode, and there was no chance of leaving early. In exchange, there would be peace, Mr. Finch said, raising one pointed finger. And in exchange, Gibda would help mankind rebuild with its own resources and advancements. Already, its drones were planting crops, and its algorithms designing genetic variations for better ones. In exchange, Gibda could provide power. Its army of drones could be deployed not only to rebuild the parts of the power grid destroyed, to get rid of it, but it could make better than it ever was before, freeing clean power for all of society. In exchange, the financial systems brought down could be restored, unfrozen. The assets held by the institutions and politicians and power brokers would be returned. The markets could move again. In his stride now, Mr. Finch pivoted on his heel back to Ty. So you see, Mr. Jackson, they could try to fight it further, but why? And at what risk? Could they trust the military systems? Could they really be sure that they'd wiped out each instance of the AI where it had spread? Even if they hit 99% of their targets, unlikely given the advancements in ballistic technology Gibda had already made, the 1% remaining could still spread again, faster than any human or virus could. I'm not saying we should, Mr. F., Ty said, walking his comments back while watching the clock inch closer. But back then, maybe it was a better option. Keep control of our own fate, right? Mr. Finch smiled and shook his head. But Ty could tell he was happy just for the engagement. He suspected that Mr. F had prepared this lecture in advance and was proud of himself in the way only a geek like Mr. F could be. Even back then, Mr. Finch said, global news outlets had seen and reported on the automated fighter drones and autonomous tanks. Government intelligence had confirmed far more sophisticated devices that Gibda could deploy if provoked. Swarms of small machines with far more lethal ambition. He paused for effect, then finished. With little reluctance, the governments of the world agreed. It was not a negotiation for peace. It was an acceptance of a new way of life. The clock struck 12, and the bell rang. Hey, wait. Before you go, from Read Before Midnight, the complete Season 1, now available on Amazon, an excerpt from the Virginia incident. She felt awkward around this woman and remembered a time from her own childhood. Her mother had brought her to the zoo, back when she had been her mother's little girl, before Hootie and before Eddie. She remembered seeing the tiger awake that day, stalking back and forth in his enclosure. The tiger moved with a grace that she could only dream of, his muscles rippling smooth under striped fur. Looking into his eyes as he looked back out, seeing the contained fury behind them, and knowing that only a sheet of glass separated her and him had filled her with a deep disquiet, like she was naked in front of strangers, exposed in the open. Remembering it now, Maria felt the same way again with this woman, like she was standing next to a tiger, a predator with grace and speed beyond her, contained only by the thinnest of barriers, by choice. "I'm sorry," the woman said abruptly, turning to Maria. "I realize that my presence here is inappropriate. It must seem strange, a woman sitting all alone in a park." Maria shook her head and lied. No, it's fine, it's fine." "Are you okay?" the woman asked then. "What?" Maria said, a bit taken aback. "Yes, it's fine, I'm fine, all good." "I mean, are you okay? Is everything all right? You seem more nervous than most people. Smell a little bit different, too." "I'm fine," Maria managed. What did she mean? Smell a bit different. What was that? Maria thought then that she might be wrong. This woman was definitely a junkie. The woman was looking at her now, black eyes within wells of darkness that Maria felt herself falling into. Her face was leaning closer somehow, the eyes becoming wider, all-encompassing. Maria's chest felt light, almost weightless. "What is your name?" the woman asked. "Maria Alvarez," Maria said, without thinking, the words spilling out before she could catch them, looking only at the eyes. Something moved then, and broke the spell. Maria turned her head to see the little girl who had rushed over and thrown her arms round her. "Mommy, mommy, mommy!" Hootie shouted, loud and intrusive in the quiet night. "Who is your friend?" she asked, a voice of bubbles and missed tension. The other woman gave Hootie another one of those beautiful smiles. "I'm Laura, sweetheart. And who are you?" Thank you very much for being here with me this season. Again, if you want to support my work, please visit fictionalpage.com or follow us on Twitter or Patreon @fictionalpage. The complete Season 1 is now available on Amazon. Season 2 of Read Before Midnight is expected to begin in October of 2023. Until then, dear friends, thank you. And wherever you are, remember that you are not alone. And I will keep being here to tell stories in the night. Until next time.